In a world where success should speak louder than prejudice, one man's quiet dignity is put to the test. What begins as a routine flight for a black tech mogul unravels into a powerful lesson on respect, resilience, and the ripple effect of standing up for what's right. This story isn't just about a journey through the skies, it's about confronting the invisible barriers that still weigh us down. What happens next will challenge perceptions and spark conversations long overdue. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, announcements echoing over the intercom, hurried footsteps tapping on the polished floors, and the low hum of travelers exchanging excited or exhausted whispers. Among the crowd, Liam Carter strode confidently, his sharp navy suit and polished Oxford shoes giving off an air of quiet authority. A sleek leather laptop bag hung effortlessly over his shoulder, and his wristwatch gleamed under the airport lights, a subtle reminder of his impeccable taste and perhaps his success. Liam was no stranger to this routine. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world, his life was a series of business meetings, keynote speeches, and red-eye flights. But today was different. This flight wasn't just a pit stop on his endless journey of innovation and success, it was the calm before one of the most critical business deals of his career. Approaching the gate, he offered a polite nod to the attendant scanning tickets. She glanced at him with a professional smile, scanning his boarding pass without a hitch. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. But not everyone shared her courtesy. As Liam stepped onto the plane, he was greeted by the first-class flight attendant, Ava Maxwell. Her uniform was crisp, her posture rigid, but her eyes, those betrayed something colder. They lingered just a bit too long, scanning Liam in a way that felt less like acknowledgement and more like judgment. "Good evening," Liam said, with his signature calmness, handing over his ticket. Ava's lips tightened into a forced smile, the kind that barely masked her skepticism. Her eyes flicked to the bold one A printed on his ticket, then back to him. She hesitated. For a moment, it seemed as if she was going to say something, but instead, she simply scanned the ticket with a mechanical beep. "That's first class," she said flatly, as though she needed to remind him. Her tone was void of warmth, bordering on condescension. Liam raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback. "Yes, I'm aware," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze scrutinizing him once more, but she didn't challenge him outright. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing half-heartedly toward the first-class cabin. "Right this way," she said, her tone clipped. Liam nodded, brushing off the awkward exchange. He wasn't one to dwell on small slights. His focus was on the bigger picture, the deal awaiting him on the other side of this flight. As he entered the plush first-class cabin, he felt the stares. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. A businessman in the corner lowered his newspaper slightly, stealing a glance. A young couple whispered softly, their eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. Liam, accustomed to the microaggressions that often accompanied his success, ignored it all. Instead, he settled into his seat, 1A, a spacious corner with privacy and a stunning view of the wing. He placed his laptop bag under the seat in front of him and pulled out his tablet. Within moments, he was immersed in his work, reviewing critical notes for the next day's pitch. The cabin around him faded into the background as he focused on what truly mattered. But not everyone could let him fade into the background. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Ava, standing at the edge of the cabin, her gaze fixed on him. Her expression wasn't overtly hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was as if she was waiting for him to make a mistake, something to validate whatever unspoken narrative she'd already constructed about him. The moment passed quickly, she turned away, disappearing toward the galley. Liam exhaled softly, shaking his head. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The hum of the engines began to grow louder as the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board and preparing them for takeoff. Liam leaned back in his seat, adjusting his noise-canceling headphones and letting his thoughts drift toward tomorrow's meeting. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Why had Ava hesitated? What had she seen in him or failed to see that made her pause? As the plane lifted off the ground, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be more eventful than he had anticipated. The flight had reached its cruising altitude. The soothing chime of the seatbelt sign turning off signaled the start of service in the first-class cabin. Passengers adjusted their recliners, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others immersing themselves in their own little worlds. For Liam Carter, however, the flight had already felt more exhausting than it should have. Liam had opened his tablet, its screen glowing with a detailed blueprint for an upcoming AI prototype. His fingers danced across the device, annotating, organizing, and occasionally pausing to think. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was scribbling away on some mundane task. But for Liam, every stroke of his stylus was a step toward what could be a revolutionary leap in technology. As he worked, he noticed the flight attendant, Ava, emerging from the galley with a polished tray of drinks. She moved deliberately, her demeanor polished and professional as she stopped at each seat, serving champagne, water, and sparkling juices with an air of care. When she reached the row behind him, Liam glanced up momentarily, then returned to his work. But Ava never stopped at his seat. At first, he thought it might have been an oversight. Maybe she simply missed him. After all, mistakes happen. But as she disappeared back into the galley without acknowledging him, Liam couldn't ignore the subtle knot forming in his stomach. Minutes ticked by. He tried to focus on his tablet, convincing himself it wasn't worth making a scene. Yet, the small gesture, or lack thereof, gnawed at him. It wasn't about the drink, it was about the principle. Being overlooked, disregarded, it wasn't a new feeling for him. But no matter how many boardrooms he walked into or awards he received, it still stung in moments like these. When Ava returned, this time with a cart laden with first-class appetizers, artfully plated hors d'oeuvres that screamed luxury, Liam decided to wait and observe. He watched as she paused at each seat, offering the delicacies with an unhurried grace. She lingered for brief exchanges with passengers, laughing politely at their jokes or offering suggestions for wine pairings. Her demeanor was warm, attentive, but when she reached his seat, her pace seemed to quicken. She glanced at him briefly before moving past, as though he were invisible. Liam leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. "Excuse me," he called out, his tone calm but firm. Ava stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. "Yes?" she asked, her voice neutral but tinged with impatience. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" he asked politely. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll get to you when I have time," she replied curtly before continuing down the aisle. The response was sharp, dismissive. It wasn't the words alone, it was the tone, the clipped delivery that carried an unspoken message. "You're not a priority." Liam felt his jaw tighten, but he quickly caught himself. He wasn't going to let this spiral, not here, not now. Years of navigating similar situations had taught him to choose his battles wisely. He returned to his work, his expression neutral, though his mind raced. A few seats away, an older woman had been watching the exchange. She frowned slightly, her eyes flicking between Liam and Ava. For a moment, it looked as though she wanted to speak up, but she hesitated, choosing instead to sip her drink in silence. Time dragged on. Ava continued her rounds, her interactions with other passengers noticeably more pleasant. Liam, still without so much as a glass of water, buried himself in his work. He wasn't going to beg for decency. But then came the dinner service. Ava returned with another cart, this time laden with plated gourmet meals. The aroma of roasted vegetables, grilled salmon, and decadent desserts filled the cabin. She moved methodically, placing trays before each passenger with a polite nod. Liam watched as she approached his seat once more. When she reached him, she didn't stop. "Excuse me," he said, his tone firmer now. "I believe you missed me." Ava halted, her back to him. She turned slowly, her expression one of feigned surprise. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I didn't realize you were part of this cabin." The cabin seemed to grow quieter. Nearby passengers looked up from their meals, their gazes darting between Liam and Ava. The tension was palpable. Liam set his tablet down, folding his hands in his lap. His calm exterior belied the storm brewing inside. "Yes," he said evenly. "I am. Is there a problem?" Ava's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered, muttering an apology. She placed a tray in front of him, the gesture rushed and careless, before moving on. Liam stared at the tray for a moment, his appetite gone. This wasn't about the meal or the drink, it was about respect, about the quiet erosion of dignity through small, seemingly inconsequential acts. As he picked up his tablet again, his thoughts weren't on his work, they were on the subtle but persistent question. Why is it always like this? Behind him, the older woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Others in the cabin exchanged glances, their whispers barely audible. The seeds of tension had been planted, and though Liam tried to focus on his work, the weight of the moment lingered in the air, and it was far from over. The hum of the aircraft engines was the only sound that seemed constant in the first-class cabin. Liam Carter sat quietly in his seat, his face composed, but his thoughts swirled. He glanced at the untouched tray of food Ava had placed before him, a symbolic reminder of the dismissive treatment he had endured so far. Liam wasn't new to moments like these. He'd faced them in boardrooms, conferences, and even casual social settings. But there was something uniquely isolating about experiencing it at 30,000 feet, surrounded by strangers. Here, there was no easy escape, no convenient excuse to leave the room. Here, every interaction carried the weight of scrutiny. As Ava moved about the cabin, her behavior remained consistent, warm and engaging with other passengers, cold and indifferent toward Liam. It wasn't subtle anymore. The quiet glances and murmurs from other passengers hinted that they too had noticed the disparity. Still, no one said a word. The breaking point came during dessert service. Ava returned with another cart, this time offering an array of meticulously crafted sweets. She handed out delicate plates of tiramisu and crème brûlée to the other passengers, her tone pleasant and conversational. When she reached Liam's row, she didn't even glance at him, moving on as though he didn't exist. Liam watched her for a moment, his patience finally fraying. He set his tablet down deliberately and straightened in his seat. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice calm but commanding. The tone carried weight, cutting through the quiet murmur of the cabin. Ava froze mid-step. Slowly she turned to face him, her expression a mix of annoyance and forced politeness. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice clipped. Liam gestured toward the cart. "I couldn't help but notice that you've served the dessert to everyone in this cabin except me. Is there a reason for that?" A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers who had been engrossed in their meals or conversations now turned their attention to the interaction. The tension was palpable, a current running through the air. Ava hesitated, her cheeks flushing. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Finally, she managed a weak, "I must have missed you." Liam tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Missed me?" he echoed. "That's interesting, considering this isn't the first time tonight." Her expression hardened, defensive now. "Sir, I assure you it wasn't intentional." Liam leaned forward, his voice remaining measured but unmistakably firm. Intentional or not, the result is the same. You've gone out of your way to treat me differently from every other passenger in this cabin, and I'd like to know why. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. A murmur spread among the passengers, some exchanging glances, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. From a few rows back, the older woman, who had been observing the situation, finally spoke up. "He's right," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "I noticed it too. You've been ignoring him all flight." Ava's head snapped toward the woman, her expression a mix of surprise and indignation. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her tone defensive. "I've been treating everyone equally." "Equally?" The older woman scoffed. "That's hard to believe when the evidence is right in front of us." The murmuring grew louder. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, chimed in. "I thought it was just me imagining things, but now that it's being pointed out, it's obvious. This isn't how a first-class passenger should be treated." Ava looked flustered, her professionalism slipping. She glanced around the cabin, clearly overwhelmed by the growing chorus of disapproval. Her gaze landed back on Liam, who sat silently, letting the voices of the other passengers do the work. Finally, she straightened her posture, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I'll fetch your dessert right away," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. Liam raised a hand, stopping her. "This isn't about dessert," he said firmly. "It's about respect, something I shouldn't have to ask for, especially not here." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, no one spoke. Ava stared at him, her face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Then, without another word, she turned and hurried toward the galley. The cabin remained silent for a few moments after she left. Then the older woman leaned forward, speaking directly to Liam. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "You handled it with far more grace than most of us would." Liam offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you," he said. "But it shouldn't have to be handled at all." As he settled back into his seat, the murmurs in the cabin began to die down. Passengers returned to their meals and conversations, though the atmosphere felt different now, more reflective. Liam picked up his tablet again, resuming his work, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think about the deeper implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just a moment of poor service, it was a reflection of something far more pervasive. And while he had addressed it here, he knew there were countless others who faced a similar treatment every day without the privilege of a public spotlight to back them up. The incident wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air in the first-class cabin remained thick with tension after the confrontation between Liam Carter and Ava, the flight attendant. Though the murmurs among passengers had subsided, a palpable unease lingered. Liam sat quietly in his seat, the picture of composure, though his mind was anything but calm. He had spent years learning to navigate moments like these with dignity, with restraint, and with the understanding that not every battle needed to be fought on the spot. But this time it felt different. He wasn't alone. Others had noticed, others had spoken up. Liam returned to his tablet, scrolling through his notes for the pitch he'd deliver the following morning. It wasn't just any pitch, it was the culmination of years of work, an AI innovation that promised to disrupt industries and change lives. If successful, the deal would secure partnerships worth billions, further solidifying his place among the most influential figures in tech. The faint chime of the in-flight Wi-Fi notification broke his train of thought. He glanced at the screen, a message from Nina, his assistant. "Nina, just confirming you're all set for tomorrow. Investors are already buzzing. This deal is going to be the historic." Liam smiled faintly and typed a quick response. "Everything's ready. Make sure the team has the prototype prepped. See you at the office." As he sent the message, a passenger seated across the aisle shifted in his seat, his curiosity piqued. The man, dressed in a tailored suit, had been quietly observing the events of the evening. He leaned slightly forward, trying to catch a glimpse of Liam's screen. What he saw made his eyes widen. "Liam Carter," the man whispered to himself, barely audible. He quickly reached for his phone and discreetly began typing. A quick internet search confirmed his suspicions. His jaw dropped as articles, interviews, and accolades flooded the screen. Liam Carter wasn't just another first-class passenger. He was the CEO of TechSphere, a global tech giant responsible for groundbreaking AI advancements. The company had recently made headlines for developing an AI platform that experts were calling the future of human-computer interaction. The man leaned over to his seatmate, his excitement barely contained. "Do you know who that is?" he whispered, nodding toward Liam. His seatmate, a middle-aged woman flipping through a magazine, shook her head. "Should I?" "That's Liam Carter," the man said, his voice low but insistent. "He's one of the biggest names in tech. TechSphere, the company behind all those AI breakthroughs, that's him." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "No way," she murmured, glancing at Liam. "He's been in the news everywhere lately. Isn't he supposed to be meeting with investors this week?" "Exactly," the man replied. "And after what happened earlier, I bet that flight attendant has no idea who she's been ignoring." The whispers began to spread. Passengers who had been previously disengaged from the drama were now abuzz with curiosity. One by one, phones discreetly came out, searches were made, and astonished glances were exchanged. Seated a few rows back, the older woman who had defended Liam earlier was now speaking to her husband, who had been asleep during the confrontation. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice tinged with amazement. "That gentleman Ava was so rude too? He's Liam Carter. He's a tech mogul, a billionaire." Her husband blinked in surprise, now fully awake. "No kidding?" "Well, I'll bet she's regretting that behavior now." Ava, oblivious to the growing buzz in the cabin, continued her duties. She had been careful to avoid eye contact with Liam since the confrontation, though her mind was racing. She knew she had been out of line, but the reality of her actions hadn't fully sunk in, yet. As she approached the galley to prepare for the final service of the flight, she was stopped by a sharply dressed man in his 50s. His expression was stern. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do you know who that gentleman is?" Ava hesitated, unsure how to respond. I don't understand what you mean." The man crossed his arms. "That's Liam Carter, the CEO of TechSphere. He's one of the most influential figures in the tech world, and you've been treating him like he doesn't belong here." Ava's face turned pale. She looked over her shoulder toward Liam, who was still engrossed in his tablet, seemingly unaware of the growing attention. Panic flickered in her eyes. I didn't realize." "Well, maybe you should have," the man said sharply. "Your job is to treat everyone with respect, regardless of who they are. But in this case, you just disrespected one of the most powerful men in the industry. I suggest you think about that." Ava nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned away. Her mind raced with the weight of the revelation. As the plane began its descent, the murmurs in the cabin showed no signs of dying down. Liam, however, remained focused on his work. He had long since learned to tune out the noise, both literal and metaphorical. His thoughts were on the future, the presentation, the deal, the innovations his company would bring to the world. When the plane finally landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Liam stood, adjusting his suit jacket. He moved with quiet confidence, unaffected by the subtle stares and whispers around him. As he stepped off the plane, a sleek black car was waiting for him on the tarmac. A small group of reporters and executives stood nearby, their cameras flashing as they spotted him. "Mr. Carter," one of the reporters called out. Any comments on tomorrow's big reveal? The industry is buzzing with anticipation. Liam smiled faintly, pausing to adjust his cufflinks. All I'll say is this, he said, his voice calm but firm. Always treat people with respect. You never know who you're speaking to or what they might accomplish. As the car door closed behind him and the engine purred to life, Ava watched from the plane's window, her face a mixture of regret and realization. She had misjudged him gravely, and now she was left to grapple with the consequences of her actions. The plane had landed, but the tension from the flight still lingered in the cabin. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings, yet the whispers and stolen glances toward Liam Carter showed no signs of subsiding. For Liam, the ordeal felt like just another test of his composure, one of many he had faced throughout his life. But for others in the cabin, the weight of what had transpired was only beginning to settle. Ava, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle with an air of unease. Her usually confident posture was now slumped, her movements hurried as though she were eager to escape the situation. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Liam, whose calm demeanor seemed to magnify her discomfort. She knew she had crossed the line, but the full scope of her actions hadn't hit her until the murmurs among the passengers turned into clear statements of disapproval. As Liam stood to retrieve his laptop bag from the overhead compartment, the older woman who had defended him earlier rose from her seat and stepped into the aisle. She adjusted her scarf, her expression resolute, and turned to address Ava, who was standing near the galley. "You know," the woman began, her voice firm but steady. "I've been flying for years, and I've never seen a flight attendant treat a passenger with such blatant disregard. It's shameful." Ava froze, her cheeks reddening. "Ma'am, The woman raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't bother with excuses, we all saw it. Ignoring his requests, skipping his service, speaking to him with such disrespect, it wasn't subtle." Other passengers nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of disappointment and anger. The businessman from earlier, who had recognized Liam, joined in. "She's right," he said, stepping forward. "This man didn't deserve the way you treated him, and now that we all know who he is, it's even more appalling. But it shouldn't matter who he is, everyone deserves respect." The murmurs grew louder as more passengers voiced their agreement. "I noticed it too," said a younger woman, clutching a designer handbag. "It was uncomfortable to watch. You didn't even try to hide it." Ava's eyes darted around the cabin, her confidence crumbling under the collective scrutiny. I didn't mean for it to come across that way," she stammered. "I was just busy and—" "Busy?" the older woman interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You weren't too busy to serve everyone else in this cabin with a smile. You went out of your way to make him feel unwelcome." Liam, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "Enough," he said, holding up a hand. The cabin fell silent. He looked directly at Ava, his expression unreadable. "I don't need an explanation or an apology," he said. "What's done is done, but let this be a lesson. How you treat people matters. Whether they're a CEO or someone you think doesn't belong, respect costs nothing." Ava nodded wordlessly, her face pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, realizing there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage. The older woman placed a hand on Liam's arm, her eyes warm with admiration. "Thank you for handling this with such grace," she said softly. "You've set an example for all of us." Liam offered a polite nod. "Thank you for speaking up," he replied. "It's people like you who make the difference." The businessman, too, extended a hand to Liam. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this," he said earnestly, "and thank you for reminding us all of what's important." As more passengers began to offer their support, Ava quietly retreated to the galley, her head bowed. The weight of the passengers' words and Liam's dignified response hung heavy in the air. As Liam exited the plane, the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation watched him with newfound respect. Some gave him polite nods, others whispered words of encouragement as he passed. The murmurs of discontent about Ava's behavior faded into a collective admiration for how Liam had handled the situation. The older woman, still seated, turned to her husband. "He's not just brilliant," she said. "He's kind, and that's what makes him remarkable." Her husband nodded in agreement, his gaze following Liam as he disappeared down the jet bridge. The world could use more people like him. Outside, as Liam stepped into the waiting luxury car, the events of the flight felt like a distant memory. He glanced at his tablet, his mind shifting back to the task at hand, the groundbreaking presentation he would deliver the next day. But as the car pulled away, one thought lingered. Even in the face of ignorance and bias, there was power in choosing dignity over confrontation, kindness over anger, and for the passengers who had stood up, the lesson was equally profound. Silence in the face of injustice only enables it to continue. As the car pulled away from the plane and toward the private exit reserved for high-profile travelers, Liam Carter leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. The events of the flight had been unpleasant, but sadly not unfamiliar. He had faced similar moments before, and each time he handled them with composure. Yet something about this encounter still lingered in his mind. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He picked it up and saw a notification from Nina, his assistant. "Nina, just saw a tweet about you. Something happened on the flight?" Liam frowned, his curiosity piqued. He opened his social media feed and there it was, a thread gaining traction, started by one of the first-class passengers. Tweet 1: "Witnessed an appalling situation on my flight today. Liam Carter, CEO of Tech Sphere, was treated with blatant disrespect by a flight attendant. Here's what happened. !" Tweet 2: "The flight attendant skipped him during service multiple times, spoke to him dismissively and treated him as though he didn't belong in first class. Everyone in the cabin noticed. !" Tweet 3: "Mr. Carter handled it with unbelievable grace, calmly addressing the situation without raising his voice. Other passengers, including myself, called out the behavior, but what really stuck with me was what he said. Respect costs us nothing. Powerful. 3/3. The thread was already going viral. Replies poured in, filled with outrage at the treatment Liam had endured and admiration for how he had handled it. Other passengers from the flight chimed in, confirming the story and adding their own praise for Liam's dignity and restraint. As Liam scrolled through the comments, his phone buzzed again, this time a call from Nina. "Liam, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "This story is blowing up." "I'm fine," he said calmly. "It's nothing new, unfortunately." "Well, it's everywhere now," Nina replied. "And it's sparking a massive conversation about respect, bias, and professionalism. People are even tagging the airline, demanding accountability." Meanwhile, back on the plane, Ava sat in the galley, staring at her own phone. She had seen the thread. The words stung, not because they were false, but because they were undeniably true. The comments calling for her suspension or termination felt like daggers. But what struck her most were the responses praising Liam's handling of the situation. His words echoed in her mind. Respect cost nothing. Ava's hands trembled as she closed the cap. For the first time in years, she questioned not only her actions but her assumptions about the passengers she served, about the biases she carried, and about what it meant to treat people fairly. As Liam's car pulled up to his hotel, he received another notification. This time, it was a message from the airline's CEO. "Mr. Carter, we've been made aware of your experience on our flight. Please accept our deepest apologies. We'd like to discuss this further and ensure this never happens again." Liam sighed, his resolve firm. He wasn't interested in public apologies or corporate gestures. What mattered to him was real change, both within the airline and beyond. As he stepped out of the car, he typed a quick reply, "Happy to discuss." Let's talk about systemic solutions, not just one-off responses. The unexpected twist wasn't just the viral attention or the public reckoning, it was the spark of change that Liam had ignited. What had started as a painful encounter was now a catalyst for a broader conversation about respect, accountability, and the silent biases that often go unchecked. For Liam, it was just another reminder of the power of staying true to his values, no matter the circumstance. And for Ava, it was a moment that would force her to confront the very things she had ignored for far too long. The events of the flight had taken on a life of their own, sparking debates and conversations far beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. By the time Liam Carter walked into the grand hall for his presentation, he had become more than just a tech mogul. He was a symbol of resilience and grace in the face of bias. Yet, as he stood before a packed audience of investors, executives, and tech enthusiasts, his focus remained singular: the groundbreaking AI innovation he had spent years developing. The presentation was nothing short of a masterclass. Liam spoke with confidence and clarity, walking his audience through the intricate details of the new AI prototype. The room was silent, hanging on to every word, until he concluded with a powerful demonstration of the technology's potential. The moment he finished, the room erupted in applause, cementing the success of his vision. As the attendees began to mingle, many approached Liam with handshakes and words of admiration, not just for his work but for how he had handled himself during the ordeal on the flight. Among them was Robert Hayes, the COO of the airline Liam had flown with. "Mr. Carter," Hayes said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet you. I'm Robert Hayes, and I represent the airline you traveled with yesterday." Liam shook his hand, his expression calm but guarded. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I assume you're here to discuss the incident." Hayes nodded, his tone measured but earnest. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of our entire organization. What you experienced was unacceptable. We've already taken immediate steps to address the situation, but we recognize this is part of a larger issue." Liam folded his arms, studying Hayes. "I've heard apologies before," he said. "What makes this different?" Hayes hesitated for a moment, then continued. "We're not just looking for a quick fix. We'd like to collaborate with you to redesign our training programs, focusing on inclusivity, respect, and customer care. We believe your insights could help us create real, lasting change." Liam considered his words carefully. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally. "But if I'm going to be involved, it has to be about more than just optics. Real change means confronting uncomfortable truths and committing to long-term solutions." Hayes nodded, relief evident on his face. "We're ready for that, and we'd be honored to have your guidance." Later that evening, as Liam settled into his hotel room, he reflected on the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. His phone buzzed with notifications, news articles praising his professionalism, social media posts sharing the viral story, and countless messages of support. Among them was one that caught his attention. It was a direct message from Ava, the flight attendant. "Ava, Mr. Carter, I know my words can't undo the way I treated you, but I want to thank you. Your response made me reflect on my actions and the biases I've been carrying. I'm committed to changing, and I'm truly sorry." Liam stared at the message for a moment, then typed a simple reply. "Growth starts with reflection. Wishing you the best on your journey." The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Liam stood by the window of his suite, watching the world come to life. The events of the flight had left their mark, not just on him, but on the passengers, the airline, and even Ava. In the end, it wasn't about a single incident or a viral story, it was about the power of moments to spark change, the importance of standing firm in one's values, and the impact of choosing dignity over anger. What would you have done if you were in Liam's shoes or one of the passengers on that flight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that spark change.